Some stories aren't just told, they are felt. Welcome to Phoenix Soul Stories. Sometimes the only way to save a life is to break the moment everyone thinks is perfect. The chandelier light shimmered across crystal glasses and polished marble, casting quiet reflections that made everything feel controlled, expensive, untouchable. And at the center of it all sat Ethan Caldwell, a man who had built a 9-figure empire by predicting outcomes before they happened, his tailored navy suit fitting like certainty, his watch ticking with quiet authority, his attention split between a negotiation worth millions and the subtle impatience of someone who was never used to waiting. And just beyond his table, moving unnoticed like a shadow that knew exactly where to step, Clara Bennett carried a tray of sparkling water, her posture straight, her expression calm, her presence almost invisible in a room filled with voices that believed volume meant importance. She didn't speak unless spoken to, didn't linger, didn't exist beyond the role she was paid to perform, and yet her eyes moved differently, not scanning for tips or approval, but for patterns, for details, for the quiet things people missed when they believed they were in control. Ethan barely glanced at her when she approached, offering a brief nod that wasn't unkind, but wasn't curious either. To him, she was part of the environment, like the music or the lighting, something designed to support the moment, but never define it. Sparkling or still, sir? She asked softly, her voice steady, her tone neutral. He answered without looking up. Sparkling. Already returning to the numbers on his screen, the conversation at the table continued, confident, polished, predictable. But Clara didn't move away right away, not because she forgot, but because something didn't align, a flicker in the rhythm of the room, a pause that didn't belong. She noticed a man 2 tables behind, well-dressed, composed, but not engaged, his eyes fixed not on his own company but on Ethan, his hand resting near his jacket, too still, too deliberate. Clara's gaze lingered for half a second longer than it should have. Then she stepped back, blending again into the motion of service. But the feeling didn't leave. It sharpened, like a note just slightly off-key. Ethan leaned back in his chair, one hand gesturing as he made a point, confident, assured, unaware that the moment he believed he controlled was already shifting. Clara moved again, this time faster, not rushed, but precise, like someone who had already decided before anyone else realized there was a decision to make. The room was still filled with quiet laughter, the soft clink of glasses, the illusion of safety. And then it happened. Not loud, not chaotic, just one sudden movement that cut through everything. Clara stepped in and struck Ethan across the side of his face, not with anger, not with hesitation, but with exact timing. His head turned sharply, his chair shifting slightly. The entire room froze. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses hovered in midair. Eyes widened. Confusion spread faster than sound. Ethan blinked, stunned, not by pain but by impossibility, because nothing like this ever happened to him. Not in his world, not in his carefully controlled environment. His hand rose instinctively to his cheek, his expression hardening, searching for an explanation that didn't exist yet. What? He started, his voice low, controlled, but before the sentence could finish, Clara leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper, steady, urgent, and completely without panic. I'm sorry, if I was 1 second late. You wouldn't be here right now. Her eyes held his, not apologizing for the action, only for the necessity. And for a moment, something shifted in Ethan's expression, not understanding, not yet, but recognition that this wasn't chaos. It was intention. Behind them, a chair scraped. Loudly, a man stumbled, restrained suddenly by 2 others, a small object slipping from his hand and landing on the floor with a soft, almost insignificant sound. The illusion shattered, not with noise, but with realization. The room began to move again, voices rising, security stepping in, but Ethan didn't look away from Clara, because in that one impossible moment, the world he trusted to be predictable had broken open, and the only person standing calmly in the center of it was the one he had almost completely ignored. The room did not erupt all at once. It fractured in layers. First the silence, then the whispers, then the sharp intake of breath as reality caught up with what everyone had just witnessed. A billionaire struck in the middle of a 5-star dining room by someone no one had noticed until that exact second. Ethan Caldwell, did not move immediately. His mind did not jump to anger the way it usually would. Instead, it paused, calculating, searching for logic in a moment that made none, his cheeks still warm, his eyes fixed on Clara Bennett, who had already stepped back half a pace, not retreating, not apologizing again, just creating space as if she understood that what came next belonged to him, not her. Behind them, chairs scraped louder now. Security had the man pinned, not violently, but firmly controlled. The kind of control that came from training, not panic. A small metallic object rested on the floor near the table leg. Thin, precise, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Ethan's gaze flickered toward it for a fraction of a second, then back to Clara. "Explain," he said, his voice low, not raised, not emotional, which somehow made the word heavier. Clara exhaled slowly, not nervous, just measured. "He was not watching his table," she said, her tone even. "He was watching you." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "A lot of people watch me," he replied, but there was less certainty in it than usual. Clara shook her head just a little. "Not like that." A pause, and his hand never matched his breathing. Ethan frowned, not because he disagreed, but because he understood exactly what she meant. He had spent years reading markets, reading people, reading risk, but he had been reading the wrong signals tonight. He had been reading what was presented, not what was hidden. The manager rushed over, words spilling too quickly, apologies layered over confusion, promises of handling everything. But Ethan lifted a hand slightly, and the man stopped mid-sentence. The room quieted again, waiting, always waiting for his reaction, for his judgment, for the version of reality he would choose to accept. But Ethan did not look at the manager. He did not look at security. He did not even look at the man being escorted out. He looked at Clara, because she was the only variable he had not accounted for. "You saw all of that in seconds," he said, not asking. Confirming, Clara gave a small shrug. "Not seconds," she replied. "It started when he walked in." Ethan's eyes narrowed, interest replacing irritation. "And you stayed quiet." Clara met his gaze without hesitation. "I needed to be sure." A beat. Timing matters. The words landed differently than anything else that night. Not dramatic, not defensive, just true, and that truth unsettled him more than the incident itself, because it meant she had chosen the exact moment to act, not the earliest, not the safest, the exact one that would work. The assistant at Ethan's side leaned in, whispering something about rescheduling, about security reviews, about leaving immediately, but Ethan did not move. Not yet. His world had shifted by a fraction of an inch, and he could feel it. The kind of shift that changed everything if you ignored it, or revealed everything if you followed it. Clara turned slightly, ready to step away, to disappear back into the role the room expected her to play, but Ethan spoke again. "Wait." The word stopped her, not because of authority, but because of tone. It was different now. Less command, more focus. She turned back. "Yes, sir," she said, still professional, still composed. Ethan studied her. Really studied her this time. Not the uniform, not the role, but the person inside it, the steadiness in her posture, the absence of performance in her expression, the way she did not try to explain more than necessary, did not try to impress, did not try to justify. She had done something that could not be undone, and she stood by it without asking for anything in return. "What is your name?" he asked, the question simple, but the shift behind it unmistakable. Clara hesitated for the first time, not out of fear, but out of habit, as if names were something she did not offer easily. "Clara," she said finally, then added, "Clara Bennett." Ethan nodded once, committing it to memory the way he did with numbers that mattered. "You are not just a waitress," he said, not as an accusation, but as an observation. Clara's lips curved just slightly, not quite a smile, not quite a deflection. "Tonight, I am," she answered, and then, without waiting for permission, without needing acknowledgement, she stepped away, disappearing back into the movement of the room that had slowly begun to breathe again. But Ethan did not return to his meeting. He did not pick up his phone. He did not resume control the way he always did, because for the first time in a long time, control had not saved him, someone else had, and she had done it without asking, without announcing, without needing him to understand until it was already over. And that unsettled him more than anything else in the room. The restaurant slowly returned to its rhythm, but it was not the same rhythm as before. Conversations resumed yet carried a different weight. Glances lingered longer, voices lowered as if everyone had just witnessed something they could not fully explain. Ethan Caldwell remained seated, untouched glass of sparkling water still in front of him, condensation sliding down the side as time moved forward without his permission. His associates spoke carefully now, their earlier confidence replaced by subtle hesitation. But Ethan was no longer listening. His attention had shifted entirely to a question he could not easily answer. Who was Clara Bennett? He had met thousands of people who wanted something from him. People who spoke too much, revealed too much, tried too hard. But she had done the opposite. She had acted with precision and then withdrawn without expectation, without performance. And that absence of intention made her impossible to categorize. He stood abruptly, not out of anger, but out of decision. His assistant moved quickly. "Sir, your car is ready." Ethan nodded once, but his eyes were not on the exit. They moved across the room, scanning, searching, until he found her again, near the service station, already back to work, already invisible, taking an order from a couple who had no idea what had just happened 5 minutes earlier. Her voice calm, her posture unchanged, as if the moment that had shifted everything for him had not shifted anything for her. Ethan walked toward her, each step deliberate, measured, not rushed, not hesitant. When he reached her, he did not interrupt immediately. He waited, something he almost never did, until she finished speaking to the guests, until she stepped away, until she acknowledged his presence with a quiet, professional glance. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, not surprised, just aware. Ethan studied her again, closer this time, noticing details he had missed before, the faint tension in her shoulders that suggested discipline, not stress, the way her eyes tracked movement in the room even while standing still, the absence of distraction in her focus. "You saw something no one else did," he said. Clara tilted her head slightly. "I saw something most people ignore," she replied. Ethan considered that, then asked, "And what do most people ignore?" Clara's answer came without delay. "Anything that does not fit what they expect." The simplicity of it landed harder than a complex explanation ever could. Ethan let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. "That includes me," he said. Clara's expression did not change, but there was a flicker in her eyes, acknowledgement, not agreement, not disagreement, just recognition. A server passed behind her, calling her name softly, reminding her of the role she was supposed to remain inside. Clara glanced briefly in that direction, then back at Ethan. "Is there anything else you need, sir?" she asked, the question polite, but the boundary clear. Ethan understood the boundary, but he did not step back. "Not yet." "Yes," he said, reaching into his jacket, pulling out a card, placing it on the small service counter between them, not pushing it toward her, not forcing it into her hand, just leaving it there. "Call me," he added. Clara did not look at the card immediately. She looked at him, measuring something deeper than the request itself. "Why?" she asked, not skeptical, not curious, just direct. Ethan paused, not because he did not have an answer, but because none of his usual answers applied. "Because I do not like variables I cannot understand," he said finally. Clara's lips curved slightly again. That same almost smile, almost deflection. "I am not a variable," she replied. Then after a brief pause, "I am just someone who pays attention." Ethan nodded slowly, accepting the correction without argument. "Then I need more people who pay attention," he said. Clara reached for the card, not quickly, not reluctantly, just with intention. She glanced at it for less than a second before slipping it into the pocket of her apron. "We will see," she said. Not a promise, not a rejection, just a possibility. Ethan stepped back then, the conversation complete in a way that felt unfinished. He turned and walked toward the exit, his assistant already on the phone, already trying to restore order to a night that no longer followed the plan. Outside, the cool air hit him, sharp, grounding. The city moved as it always did, taxis passing, lights changing, people walking with purpose, unaware that something had shifted inside one man who rarely allowed anything to shift at all. Ethan paused beside his car for a brief moment, looking back through the glass of the restaurant, searching for a glimpse of her again, but she was already gone from view. Absorbed back into the system that had almost hidden her completely, he slid into the car, the door closing with a quiet, controlled sound. But his mind did not return to business, did not return to numbers or deals or outcomes. It stayed with a single thought that refused to leave. Not about the incident, not about the risk, but about her, because for the first time in a long time, someone had stepped into his world without asking permission, changed the outcome, and then walked away as if it had never been hers to begin with. And that was something he could not ignore. The city did not slow down for realization. It never did. Traffic flowed in restless lines, headlights cutting through the night like quiet urgency, and inside the back seat of a black sedan moving steadily along Park Avenue, Ethan Caldwell sat with his gaze fixed on nothing and everything at once. His phone buzzed twice in his hand, then a third time, messages stacking, decisions waiting, numbers demanding attention, but for once, he did not respond. He turned the screen face down beside him, something he had not done in years. The driver glanced once in the rearview mirror, sensing the unusual silence but saying nothing, because men like Ethan Caldwell were not known for quiet. They were known for momentum, for constant motion, for control that never paused. And yet tonight there was a pause, subtle, but undeniable. Ethan leaned back slightly, replaying the moment not as an event, but as a sequence. The angle of her movement, the timing, the absence of hesitation. It had not been luck. It had not been instinct alone. It had been training, refined, practiced, buried beneath a uniform that suggested none of it existed. "Sir, would you like me to head to the office or your residence?" the driver asked carefully. Ethan did not answer immediately. His mind was still in the restaurant, still in that exact second where everything had shifted. "Office," he said finally, his voice steady again, but different, quieter. As the car turned downtown, the city lights reflected against the window, blurring into streaks of gold and white, and Ethan's thoughts sharpened instead of settling. Because if there was one thing he understood better than most, it was inconsistency, and Clara Bennett was a contradiction he could not ignore. A waitress who read a room like a strategist, who moved like someone trained under pressure, who spoke only when necessary and disappeared the moment attention turned toward her. It did not align, not with the world he understood, not with the patterns he trusted. And when something did not align, Ethan did not dismiss it, he investigated it. 30 minutes later, the car pulled into the private underground garage of his building. Doors opening before the vehicle had fully stopped, security present, efficient, invisible in their own way. Ethan stepped out without breaking stride, moving through glass doors, past polished stone floors, into an elevator that responded only to his presence. The ride up was silent, smooth, uninterrupted, but his mind was anything but. By the time the doors opened into his office, the decision had already been made. "I want everything you can find on Clara Bennett," he said as soon as his assistant appeared. No greeting, no context needed. She nodded. Once, already understanding the tone meant urgency. "Tonight," he added, and she did not question it, because she had never heard him say a name like that before, not without attaching it to a deal, a risk, or a threat. But this time there was something else, something she could not quite define. Ethan walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city stretching out beneath him like something he owned and controlled. But it did not feel that way in that moment, not entirely, because somewhere in that city was a woman who had stepped into his life without invitation and altered the outcome of it in less than a second. And he did not yet understand how. Hours passed without him noticing. Reports came in fragments, incomplete, inconsistent. "Basic employment records match," his assistant said carefully, standing a few feet behind him. "Clara Bennett, age 27, works at the restaurant part-time, no criminal record, no outstanding issues." Ethan did not turn. "And before that?" he asked, the question quiet, but pointed. There was a brief pause. "There is a gap," she admitted. 3 years with no formal employment record, no registered address change, no activity that appears in standard databases." Ethan's reflection in the glass stilled. "People do not disappear for 3 years without reason," he said, more to himself than to her. "No, sir," she replied. "They do not." Ethan turned. Then, finally facing the room again, his expression not frustrated, not impatient, but focused in a way that suggested something deeper had been engaged. Dig deeper, he said. Not the obvious sources, the ones people do not think to check. His assistant nodded. Already moving. Already recalibrating her approach, because this was not a routine inquiry anymore. This was something personal, though neither of them said it out loud. When she left the room, the silence returned, but it was not empty. It carried weight, intention, curiosity that refused to settle. Ethan walked back to his desk, picking up his phone again, not to respond to the dozens of messages waiting, but to open a single contact, the one he had not expected to matter. His thumb hovered for a moment over the screen, then stopped, because for the first time, he was not sure how to proceed. He could command, request, demand, offer. Those were languages he spoke fluently, but this was different. Clara Bennett had not responded to authority, had not reacted to status. She had acted on something else entirely, something he could not buy, could not predict, and that realization forced him into unfamiliar territory, one where control was not immediate, where understanding had to come first. Ethan set the phone down again, slowly this time, choosing not to call, not yet, because some things, he understood now, required observation before action, patience before decision, and somewhere across the city, in a place far less controlled. Clara Bennett was likely moving through her night the same way she always did, unnoticed, precise, carrying a life that did not align with the one he knew. And for the first time in years, Ethan Caldwell found himself waiting, not because he had to, but because he chose to, and that choice changed everything. Morning did not bring clarity, it brought movement, and Clara Bennett moved through it the same way she moved through everything else, quietly, efficiently, without asking for recognition. The city was colder at 6:30 in the morning, the kind of cold that settled into the edges of sidewalks and lingered in the air before the sun decided to rise. And inside a small clinic tucked between a laundromat and a closed hardware store, Clara tied her hair back with practiced hands, her uniform. Different now, simpler, worn but clean, her focus already shifting from the noise of the night before to the needs of the people in front of her. "You are early again," the older nurse behind the counter said, not surprised, just observant. Clara gave a small nod. "There is always more to do," she replied, her voice calm, her movement steady. She picked up a clipboard, scanning names, conditions, details that mattered more than titles or wealth ever could. A man sat near the window, his hands rough, his posture tired. Clara approached him without hesitation, crouching slightly to meet his eye level. "Let me see," she said gently, not asking permission, but offering reassurance. Her hands moved with precision, adjusting, checking, guiding. The same precision that had stopped a moment from going wrong the night before. But here, no one noticed it as extraordinary. Here, it was simply necessary, across the city, in a building that reached into the skyline. Ethan Caldwell stood by his window again, but this time he was not looking outward, he was listening. His assistant stood a few feet away, holding a file that was thinner than it should have been. "It took longer than expected," she said carefully, placing it on the desk. Ethan did not sit immediately. He let the silence settle first, then opened it, page by page. Not skimming, not rushing. "Paramedic training," he read aloud, more to himself than to her. "Emergency response certification, high level. Discontinued 3 years ago." He turned the page. "Volunteer clinic work. Undocumented hours." Another page. "Family medical debt." His expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, understanding beginning to replace curiosity. "Why did she leave?" he asked, the question simple, the answer not. His assistant hesitated. "There is no official record," she admitted, "but there are indications of a personal situation, long-term care, financial strain." Ethan closed the file slowly, not with finality, but with recognition, because for the first time, the pieces began to align, not in a way that simplified her, but in a way that explained her. Clara Bennett was not an anomaly. She was a decision, a series of choices made under pressure, a skill set that had not disappeared, only redirected, and that made her even more significant than he had initially thought. "Where is she now?" he asked. His assistant glanced at her notes. "She works mornings at a small clinic on the west side, afternoons at the restaurant, and evenings," she paused briefly. "Various temporary shifts, depending on availability." Ethan nodded once, already moving toward his coat. Cancel my first 2 meetings, he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. His assistant did not argue. She simply adjusted the schedule, because she had learned that when Ethan Caldwell changed direction, it was not impulsive. It was intentional. 20 minutes later, his car stopped outside a building that did not match his usual world. The sidewalk uneven, the signage faded, the doors slightly misaligned from years of use. Ethan stepped out. The air sharper here, less filtered, more real. He paused for a fraction of a second before walking inside. The clinic was small, functional, filled with quiet urgency. No marble floors, no crystal light, just people waiting, hoping, enduring. And there, near the far wall, Clara Bennett moved between them. The same calm, the same focus, the same quiet authority. That did not need a title to exist. Ethan watched for a moment before she noticed him. Not because she was unaware, but because she was occupied with something that mattered more in that moment. When she finally looked up, her eyes met his, and there was no surprise, only recognition, as if she had expected that sooner or later, he would step into a world where she was not invisible. You found me, she said, not impressed, not concerned, just stating a fact. Ethan nodded slightly, taking in the room, the people, the version of her that no one at the restaurant had seen. I had to understand, he replied. Clara considered that for a brief moment, then gestured toward a chair. Then you should sit, she said, already turning back to the patient in front of her. Understanding takes time. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Caldwell did exactly that. He sat down, not as a billionaire, not as a man in control, but as someone willing to wait, watching a woman who had nothing in his world, and yet somehow had everything he had not yet learned how to measure. The clinic did not quiet down for curiosity. It demanded presence, and Clara Bennett gave it without hesitation, moving from one patient to the next with the same steady rhythm, the same measured attention, while Ethan Caldwell remained seated in a chair that was slightly too small and slightly too worn for someone used to boardrooms and leather upholstery. His hands rested loosely together, not fidgeting, not checking his phone, simply observing, which in itself was unusual, because observation without control had never been his strength. Yet here he was, watching a world that did not revolve around him. A world where urgency was not defined by profit margins or negotiations, but by something far more immediate, far more human. Clara finished wrapping a bandage. Her movements precise, efficient, then stood and turned toward Ethan again, not rushing, not acknowledging his presence as something disruptive, just including him in the space the way she included everything else. You are still here, she said, her tone neutral. Ethan gave a small nod. You said understanding takes time, he replied. Clara considered that for a moment, then glanced toward the waiting area, where another patient shifted uncomfortably in their seat. Then you are learning the first part, she said, before stepping away again, leaving him with nothing but time and observation. Minutes passed, then more, the kind of minutes that stretched differently when there was no agenda attached to them. Ethan noticed things he would normally filter out. The way Clara spoke softer to older patients, the way she adjusted her pace depending on who she was helping, the way she never wasted movement, never repeated a step, everything intentional, everything efficient, but not cold, never cold. And that was the difference, because efficiency in his world often meant distance. Here it meant care. Eventually the room thinned, the quiet settling into something more manageable. Clara washed her hands, dried them carefully, then walked over to where Ethan sat, this time not as a server, not as a worker in motion, but as someone who had finished what needed to be done. You have questions, she said, not asking, just recognizing. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his posture less rigid than before. I do, he admitted. Clara pulled a chair across from him, sitting down without ceremony, without concern for hierarchy, the space between them equal in a way his world rarely allowed. Then ask, she said. Ethan paused, choosing his words more carefully than usual. Why leave something you were clearly good at, he said, referring to the file, to the training, to the version of her that did not match the present. Clara's gaze shifted briefly, toward the window, not avoiding the question, but acknowledging it, because being good at something does not always mean you get to keep doing it, she replied, her voice calm. Not bitter, just factual. Ethan frowned slightly. That is not an answer, he said. Clara looked back at him, meeting his expectation without reacting to it. It is the only one that matters, she said, then added after a moment. My mother got sick. Long-term care, no insurance that covered what she needed, and I had to choose between staying in a job that required everything from me or being present for someone who had already given everything to me. Ethan's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough, understanding replacing assumption. So you chose this, he said. Clara shook her head slightly. I chose her, she corrected, the distinction simple, but absolute. Ethan leaned back, processing that, because in his world, choices were often calculated, optimized, structured for maximum return. But this was not that kind of choice. This was something else entirely, something that did not fit into spreadsheets or projections. And now, he said, gesturing slightly around the clinic. Clara followed his motion with her eyes. Now I do what I can with what is left, she replied. No self-pity, no regret, just reality, a quiet kind of acceptance that did not need validation. Ethan was silent for a moment, not because he had nothing to say, but because what he would normally say did not apply. Here, finally he spoke. You saved my life. The words direct, unembellished. Clara did not react the way most people would have. She did not dismiss it, did not emphasize it. She simply nodded once. Yes, she said, as if confirming a completed task. Ethan exhaled slowly, almost a quiet laugh. And that does not seem to matter to you, he observed. Clara's lips curved slightly again. That familiar, almost smile. It mattered in that moment, she said. That was enough? Ethan studied her, the simplicity of her response more complex than anything he was used to. Most people would expect something after that, he said. Clara tilted her head. Most people are used to being owed, she replied. I am not. The statement hung between them. Not heavy, not confrontational, just clear. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing it, then reached into his pocket again, not pulling out a card this time, but something smaller, simpler. He placed it on the chair beside him, not offering it directly, not framing it as a transaction. Then this is not payment, he said. Clara glanced at it briefly, then back at him. Then what is it? She asked. Ethan met her gaze, his answer quieter than anything he had said before. An opportunity, he replied. Not because I owe you, but because I do not want to ignore something I recognize. Clara did not reach for it immediately. She let the silence sit, considering not just the object, but the intention behind it. And for the first time since he had met her, Ethan Caldwell did not try to predict the outcome. He simply waited, because he was beginning to understand that with Clara Bennett, some answers could not be calculated. They had to be chosen. Clara did not reach for the envelope right away. She looked at it the way she looked at everything unfamiliar, not with suspicion, but with careful distance, as if understanding required space before action. The clinic around them continued its quiet rhythm. A chair shifted, a door opened, a voice called out a name. But in that small moment, everything narrowed to the space between them and the object resting beside Ethan. Opportunities usually come with expectations, she said finally, her tone even, her eyes steady on him. Ethan did not deny it. Most of them do, he replied. This one comes with a question instead. Clara tilted her head slightly. What kind of question? Ethan leaned forward just enough to close the distance, not imposing, just present. What would you do, he asked, if you did not have to choose between survival and what you are capable of? The words were simple, but they carried weight, not as a challenge, not as an offer, but as a possibility that had not existed in her world for a long time. Clara's gaze dropped briefly to the envelope, then back to him. And for the first time since he had met her, there was a pause that was not calculated, not immediate, but reflective. I do not think about things that are not real, she said after a moment. Ethan nodded slowly. That is fair, he replied. But sometimes reality changes before we decide to acknowledge it. Clara considered that, her expression unchanged, but something quieter moving beneath it. Not doubt, not hope, just awareness. She reached for the envelope then, not quickly, not hesitantly, just with intention, her fingers brushing the edge before lifting it. The weight was light, but not meaningless. She did not open it immediately. She held it for a second longer than necessary, then set it beside her on the chair instead of in her pocket. A choice, small, but deliberate. I will think about it, she said, not as a promise, but as a boundary. Ethan accepted it without pushing. Further, because he understood now that pushing was not how this worked. That is all I am asking, he said. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence not uncomfortable, just present. Then a voice called Clara's name from across the room. She stood without hesitation, the conversation ending not with a conclusion, but with a continuation. People are waiting, she said simply. Ethan nodded. They usually are, he replied, and she moved away again, returning to the rhythm that defined her world, leaving him seated in a place that did not belong to him, holding on to a moment that did not fit into anything he had planned. Later that evening, the city shifted again, lights brightening as the day gave way to night, and inside the restaurant where everything had started, Clara moved through her shift with the same quiet precision, the same controlled presence. Nothing in her movements suggested that anything had changed, but something had, subtle, internal. The envelope now rested in her locker, unopened, not ignored, just waiting, as if she understood that some decisions required time to settle before they could be made. Across the room, Ethan entered again, not announced, not surrounded by attention, just present, his usual table waiting, but his gaze moved first, searching, finding her almost immediately, not because she stood out, but because now he knew where to look. Clara noticed him too, but she did not react, did not approach, did not change her pace. She finished what she was doing, then moved toward his table only when it was her turn, the same as before, the same question, the same tone, sparkling or still. She asked, as if the world had not shifted between them. Ethan almost smiled, almost sparkling. He answered, and for a brief second, there was something unspoken in the exchange, not tension, not familiarity, but recognition, something quieter, deeper. Clara placed the glass in front of him, then paused for just a fraction longer than necessary. You came back, she said, not questioning, just observing. Ethan met her gaze. I do not ignore things that matter, he replied. Clara's expression softened just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him to see. Then you should learn to recognize them sooner, she said, before turning away, leaving him with a statement that felt less like criticism and more like direction. Ethan leaned back in his chair, watching her move through the room again. But this time, he was not observing a mystery. He was witnessing a pattern he was beginning to understand, not fully, not yet, but enough to know that whatever came next would not be something he could control in the way he was used to. And for the first time in a long time, that did not frustrate him, it intrigued him, because somewhere between a moment that could have ended everything and a conversation that changed nothing on the surface, something had begun, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, in the space where two very different worlds had collided and neither one had turned away. The night carried a different kind of tension, not loud, not obvious, but present in the spaces between movements, in the way the air felt slightly heavier than usual, and Clara Bennett noticed it before anyone else did, not because she was looking for it, but because she never stopped paying attention. The restaurant moved as it always did, polished, controlled, predictable on the surface, but beneath that surface, something was misaligned again, a rhythm that did not match the rest. She adjusted a glass on a table that did not need adjusting, her eyes scanning without appearing to. Ethan Caldwell sat at his usual place, composed, focused, but more aware now than he had been before, his attention no longer confined to his meeting. It moved, subtle, following the same instinct that had begun to shift inside him, and for a brief moment, their eyes met across the room, not by accident, not entirely. Clara's expression did not change, but she gave the smallest signal, a pause, a stillness that did not belong in motion, and Ethan understood, not fully, but enough. He set his glass down slowly, his posture adjusting. Just slightly, less exposed, more grounded, as if he was learning to exist in a space where control came from awareness, not assumption. Clara moved closer, not directly to him, but to the table beside his, her movements fluid, uninterrupted, but her voice when she spoke was just low enough to reach him without drawing attention. Do not stand, she said softly. as if commenting on the placement of a dish. Ethan did not react outwardly, did not turn, did not question. He simply listened, because something in her tone left no room for doubt. "There is a loose fixture above the entry," she continued, her words precise, neutral, almost casual. "It will not hold if there is a sudden shift." Ethan's gaze flickered upward for less than a second, enough to confirm, not enough to expose. The overhead installation, decorative, heavy, suspended, something he would have never considered a risk, and yet now, in this moment, it became one. "How certain?" he murmured, his voice equally controlled. Clara adjusted a napkin, her hands steady. "Certain enough," she replied. A pause. Timing matters. The same words she had used before, but now they carried deeper meaning. Ethan leaned back slightly, not abruptly, not noticeably, just enough to change his position relative to the structure above. His assistant glanced at him, confused for a moment, but he gave no explanation, because explanations were not always necessary. Seconds passed, the kind that stretched when awareness sharpened, and then, without warning, a sharp sound echoed from above. Not an explosion, not chaos, just the unmistakable shift of something giving way. The fixture above the entry swayed, then dropped, not directly where Ethan had been, but close enough that the difference between where he was and where he had been became everything. The room reacted in fragments, gasps, movement, staff rushing to secure the area, guests stepping back, startled but unharmed. And through it all, Clara remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if the outcome had already been decided before it happened. Ethan stood now, but not in panic, in clarity, his eyes moving immediately to her, not to the incident, not to the staff managing it, but to the person who had seen it before anyone else, who had acted again without announcement. Without hesitation, he crossed the space between them, not hurried, but direct. "Twice," he said quietly, the word carrying more weight than volume ever could. Clara met his gaze. "It is not about the number," she replied. "It is about the moment." Ethan studied her, something shifting deeper now, beyond curiosity, beyond intrigue, something more personal, more undeniable. "You knew," he said, not questioning. Clara shook her head slightly. "I noticed," she corrected. Ethan let out a slow breath, the realization settling fully now. This was not coincidence, not luck, not something he could categorize and move past. This was someone who saw the world differently, who moved through it with a level of awareness he had not recognized until now. "Come with me," he said, not as an order, but as an invitation that carried weight. Clara glanced briefly at the room, at the staff still restoring order, then back at him. "I have responsibilities," she said simply. Ethan nodded, understanding, but not stepping back entirely. "So do I," he replied. A pause. "But I am starting to realize that some of them are not where I thought they were." Clara held his gaze for a moment longer, something unspoken passing between them, not agreement, not refusal, just recognition of a shift that neither of them could ignore anymore. And for the first time, the space between their worlds did not feel like distance. It felt like a path, uncertain, unplanned, but real, shaped not by control, but by the quiet, undeniable truth that neither of them could walk away from what had just begun. Rain fell softly against the glass, not heavy, not urgent, just steady enough to quiet the city into a slower rhythm. And under the narrow shelter of the restaurant's side entrance, Clara Bennett stood with her coat pulled slightly tighter around her shoulders. The shift finally over, the night still lingering in the edges of her thoughts. She had not opened the envelope yet, not fully, only enough to understand what it represented. Not money alone, not an offer alone, but a door she had not allowed herself to see for a long time. Footsteps approached behind her, measured, familiar now, and she did not turn immediately, because she already knew who it was. Ethan Caldwell stepped beside her, not too close, not distant either, just present in a way that no longer felt like intrusion. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the sound of rain filling the space where words usually tried to take control. "You always wait until everything is quiet," he said finally, his voice softer than it had ever been in the rooms he owned. Clara glanced at him briefly, then back at the street. "It is easier to hear what matters," she replied. Ethan followed her gaze. The reflections of streetlights stretching across wet pavement, distorted, but still clear enough to guide movement. "And what matters now?" he asked, not testing, not pushing, just asking. Clara took a slow breath, the kind that carried more than the moment itself. "Deciding if I am allowed to want something different," she said, the honesty of it unguarded. Rare. Ethan turned slightly toward her, not interrupting, not filling the silence that followed, because he had learned that silence was not empty. It was space, and she continued after a moment. "I spent so long choosing what was necessary that I forgot what was possible." Ethan nodded once, understanding more than she expected. "And now," he said. Clara's hand moved inside her coat, pulling out the envelope, not holding it tightly, just holding it, as if its weight had changed since the first time she touched it. "Now I have to decide if possibility is worth the risk," she said. Ethan studied her, not the words, but the person behind them, the discipline, the restraint, the strength that did not announce itself but held everything together quietly. "It is not about the risk," he said. "It is about whether you want to stop choosing only what keeps things the same." Clara looked at him then, fully, her eyes steady, searching, not for answers, but for truth. "And what about you?" she asked. "What are you choosing?" The question shifted something in him, because for the first time, he did not have an immediate answer prepared. He did not have a strategy. He had a realization. "I am choosing not to lose something I did not even know I needed," he said, the words simple, but carrying more than any calculated statement ever could. Clara held his gaze, the rain continuing its quiet rhythm around them, and for a moment, the distance between their worlds felt smaller than it ever had, not because circumstances had changed, but because perspective had. She looked down at the envelope one last time, then back at him, and instead of placing it back into her coat, she held it out slightly, not giving it back, but not keeping it hidden either. "If I say yes," she said, her voice calm, "it is not because of this." She gestured lightly to the envelope. "It is because I choose something different." Ethan nodded, without hesitation. "That is the only reason I would accept," he replied. Clara exhaled slowly, a decision forming not as a sudden moment, but as something that had been building quietly since the first time their worlds collided. She did not speak it immediately. She did not announce it. She simply stepped forward, closing the small distance between them, standing beside him instead of across from him. And that was enough. Ethan understood, not because she said it, but because she stayed, and sometimes staying was the clearest answer there was. The rain softened, the city continued, and under that narrow shelter, two people who had once existed in completely separate worlds now stood in the same one, not because one had stepped into the other's life, but because they had both chosen to meet somewhere in between, where control mattered less than understanding, where status mattered less than presence, and where the quiet ones were never truly ordinary. They were simply waiting for the moment when someone finally saw them and chose not to look away. If this story touched you, do not forget to like, share where you are watching, and share this video, and subscribe to Phoenix Soul Stories channel. Your support helps us bring more powerful, emotional stories to life. Stay with us for more moments that remind you never to underestimate the quiet ones.